text today is from Isaiah 49 to 57. But I want to begin by reminding you of something I've written in the midweek memo for several weeks about our Sunday night service that we are beginning. We've just begun. We've called it Emmaus Nights. And the reason for that, it's not just some kind of a clever name, but Emmaus reminds us of those two disciples that Jesus met on that first Easter. He met them twice. He met them first as they were walking toward Emmaus, the little village outside Jerusalem. And they didn't recognize him. And they had questions because they heard rumors about the resurrection and so forth and so on. But anyway, before Jesus left them, he explained to them from the scriptures all that the Old Testament prophets had said about him. Okay. Well, later on, Jesus goes back to Jerusalem. He leaves them. And the two disciples go back to Jerusalem, and they find the disciples in the upper room. And Jesus appears to them. The first time he appeared to all the disciples together. And I want you to listen to Luke chapter 24. This is on that Easter Sunday night. The two Emmaus disciples are there. They've already heard all this, but they're going to hear it again, along with the other disciples. And here's what we read. Then Jesus said to them, the disciples, with the Emmaus disciples, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms," those are the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Everything written about me in those three parts of the Hebrew Bible, that is, the only Bible they had, and everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. The Scriptures, of course, were the Old Testament. I want you to listen to another verse. This one from 1 Peter chapter 1, where Peter writes about this great salvation that we have. And he says, concerning this salvation, this is in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully. In other words, they wrote these prophecies describing the coming Messiah, the coming salvation of the Messiah. And after they had written, it's like they were scratching their heads, wondering, what in the world have I written? That's the picture. So they, they searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ. By the way, Christ is not a name, it's a title. Christ is just the Greek form of the Hebrew Messiah. It means Messiah. It's the anointed one. So Christ, Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. What time or person or time the Spirit of Christ, Messiah, in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. Well, we're going to be looking today, and also the 22nd, and I've revised things a little bit, also on Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, at these last closing chapters of the prophecy of Isaiah, the great Old Testament prophet, the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets. And I'm going to step out on a limb here, and I want to suggest an idea to you that I want you to ponder with me for a few moments. Okay? And the idea is this. Yes, the New Testament is the completion of the prophecies, the fulfillment of the prophecies concerning Christ. But if you go back to those prophecies themselves, as we're going to do today with Isaiah, if you go back to those prophecies, and here's where I'm stepping out of it. I'm going to suggest to you that you actually learn more nature of Christ and the work that he did and who he was and why he did what he did and even how he felt about what he did. You learn more from the Old Testament than you do from the New. Kind of out on a limb there. You might want to argue that case. In other words, I'm suggesting this, that in the prophecies of the Old Testament about Christ, you get a kind of behind-the-scenes look. Have you ever seen one of those TV shows that say behind the scenes of something or other? Back in 1981, the Southern Baptist Convention was in Los Angeles. And we drove. We were living in Waco, Texas at the time. We drove out there because we made a big family deal. We went to Grand Canyon and we went to Petrified Forest. Well, we just saw the sights all the way from Texas to California. On Wednesday afternoon, that was an off day for the convention, and my brown-eyed baby, with her sister-in-law and some friends, decided they were going to go to one of the studios where they had filmed Jaws. That was the big movie, Jaws. So they got a behind-the-scenes look, and she got some pictures of that, well, you can't call it a creature, but
animatronic,
the robotic or whatever it was, coming out of the water at their boat. Pretty exciting. I wasn't there, but I didn't share the excitement. But anyway, they got a behind-the-scenes look at the making of Jaws. Well, I want to suggest to you that in Isaiah, and other prophets too, but we're looking at Isaiah, that in Isaiah we get a behind-the-scenes look at the Messiah. In Isaiah, there are what scholars call 4 servant songs. Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 50, Isaiah 52, and 3. Okay? 4 called servant songs where the star, so to speak, the main character, is someone called Eved Yahweh, the servant of the Lord. There's no doubt it's Jesus. That passage we read this morning from 1 Peter is a reference back to those prophecies, and clearly it's Jesus. So the servant is Jesus. So all these servant songs are about Jesus. And what do they tell us? Well, oh my goodness, I don't have time to even begin to scratch the surface of all they tell us, but just very quickly, almost bullet point fashion, I want to give you 5 things that these servant songs tell us about Jesus that you might not know or know as well, even from the New Testament. It's like a behind-the-scenes look at the Messiah. That makes sense? Well, here's the first one. If you'll turn to Isaiah chapter 49, we're going to take several texts from Isaiah 49. But, excuse me, this is the second of the so-called servant songs. Excuse me, I do apologize. I know that's annoying here. But so, chapter 49 begins this way. Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me, this is the servant speaking now. The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother, he named my name. Of course, this is Mary, obviously. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. Excuse me, in the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow in his quiver. He hid me away. Now, I want you to look at verse 3. Hang with me here. This is this is rather astonishing. And he, that is God the Father, he said to me, that is the servant of God, servant Jesus, and he said to me, you are my servant, what? Tell me, church. Israel. Wait a minute. Isn't he talking about an individual, a person? Yeah, he is. That's clear from reading the other servant songs and the rest of this one. He's talking about a person. So why, in this verse, does he refer to him as Israel? There are some Jews, not many, but there are some Jews who take a passage like this and say, well, all the Old Testament prophecies about the servant of the Lord are about Israel, the nation of Israel. But that's not true. We know that's not true. That's not true even here. Because look down in verse 5. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 says, and now the Lord says, he who formed me from the womb to be his servant, this is the servant speaking again, and what is the servant supposed to do? Well, excuse me, the servant is to bring Jacob back to him. Well, what does Jacob mean? Well, that's Israel. So the servant is called to bring Israel back to God. So how can the servant be Israel and yet be the redeemer of Israel? Well, oh gosh, this is deep stuff. This is kind of deep waters. Well, let me try as best I can to explain it in simple language. And the simplest way I know to explain it is this. Jesus fulfills all that Israel was supposed to do. Go back to Genesis chapter 12, whenever God calls Abraham to leave his homeland and his family, he says, I'm going to make you a blessing to the nations. I want to make you a blessing to the Gentiles. So Israel is called to be a blessing to the nations. But Israel fails. We've seen this in sermons in Isaiah. We've seen it in many times in many different ways. Israel fails time and time and time and time again. Israel fails. Israel never lives up to the calling of God to be the light to the nations. Until there is finally, at last, only one true Israelite. And who is that? Jesus, the only true Israelite. So it's as if God is saying, Israel has come down to one person. There's only one true Israelite. So there's only one true Israel, and that's Jesus Christ, who comes to be a light to the world. We'll get to that later. But he comes, first of all, listen, he comes first of all to bring Israel back to God. That's his first calling. That's why Jesus did some of the things he did. For example, Matthew chapter 15. This is our Bible study for this morning. Matthew chapter 15. We didn't get to this, but later on in that Matthew 15, Jesus is approached by a woman, a Canaanite woman, a Syrophoenician woman. And she is begging his help for her daughter. And you remember what Jesus says to her? Well, actually, that's a trick question. He doesn't say anything to her. He ignores her. And she keeps on, and she keeps on, and she keeps on, and she keeps on, until the disciples finally get weary of all this, and they come to Jesus, and essentially, I'm paraphrasing, essentially they say, give her what she wants and get rid of her. You know what Jesus says to his disciples? Go back to Matthew 15 and read it. Jesus says to his disciples, I was only sent, though, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I was sent to redeem Israel. That's what Isaiah said. He was sent to redeem Israel, to bring Jacob back. Well, the woman persists. You remember what she says? So Jesus had said it's not fitting to give the food to the dogs. And she says, well, even the dogs eat crumbs that fall from the master's table. And Jesus says, your faith has saved you. And so he does what she asks. But only because she had recognized that his mission was to Israel first. This is why, whenever the Apostle Paul went to any new city, anywhere, guess where he went first? Always to a synagogue. Why? Because, Romans chapter 1, verse 16, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God unto salvation. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So Jesus comes to do what Israel was supposed to have done and failed to do. And the first thing he has to do is to save Israel. So the gospel, when is the gospel first proclaimed? When is the church born? When? On the day of Pentecost, when Jews from all over the world had come to Jerusalem to celebrate and to hear the gospel, and the church is born. The gospel is to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. There is no room in the Christian world for hating the Jewish people. We must love the Jewish people and care what happens to them. Those who bless you, God says, I will bless. That's the first thing. first behind-the-scenes look at the Messiah, all right? A second behind-the-scenes thing about the Messiah is that he does something entirely and completely new. And in just a moment I'll explain in what way, but if you look at chapter 42, this is the first servant song. The first servant song. Chapter 42 of Isaiah, verse, let's see, what verse is that? 9. Well, let me begin in verse 8. I am the Lord, this is my name, my glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things now, I now declare before they spring forth. I tell you of them. So God declares through the servant that I am going to do something entirely new. God is promising salvation through this servant, through the Messiah, and he calls it a completely new thing. Why do you think he calls it a new thing? And he does it more than once. If you'll turn to chapter 53 of Isaiah, he says it again. This is in verse 18. Remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing what? A new thing. I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. God is doing in the servant, he is doing a new thing. What do you think he means by that? Well, I could spend days on this literally, but let me just, again, try to give it to you in the Cliff Notes, Smart Notes version. And that is that if you ask anybody in the world, you ask anybody, what does it mean to be saved? What is salvation all about? What does it mean to be a Christian? And they will say something like, obey the Ten Commandments. And my response to that is always, name them. Okay. Or they will say something like, lead a decent life, be honest, keep your nose clean, that kind of, be a decent, upstanding kind of a person. That's kind of the way the world thinks about salvation. Whenever we lived in Texas, the native Texans, and there aren't many, we've often said our son, we have 3 children, and the youngest one, Philip, was born in Texas, and we've always said he was going to drive a pickup truck with a bumper sticker that says born in Texas, because the others weren't. But anyway, not a lot of people were born in Texas, but there sure are a lot of people moving there. Anyway, so here we are in Texas. I'm pastor there, and one Christmas, this family in our church invited us over for Christmas dinner and gave us T-shirts, and the T-shirt said something like this. If you go to church, if you lead a good life, go to church and say your prayers. When you die, you will go to Texas! Well, that sure does not theologically sound on lots of grounds, but, I thought about it. It's exactly the way a lot of people think about salvation. If you lead a good life, say your prayers and go to church, you'll go to heaven. But God says, no, I'm doing something entirely new. This is not salvation the way people think of salvation. This is a completely different kind of thing. Which leads me to a third thing to say about the Messiah, again, behind the scenes. And that is that Jesus doesn't come as a hero or as a moral teacher leading the way. He's not Buddha. By the way, we don't know if there was a Buddha. The only stories of his life come from like 500 years after he supposedly lived, if he did live. It's an open question whether there actually was a Buddha or not. But at any rate, supposedly he was an enlightened teacher. That's what Buddha means, the enlightened one. So he was an enlightened teacher teaching others how to be enlightened. My brother likes to say that a pastor today is a mild-mannered man teaching mild-mannered people how to be even more mild-mannered. Seems to be lost on you. But at any rate, Jesus didn't come to be a hero. He didn't come to be a religious teacher. He came to give his life as a sacrifice for sin. I want you to turn over to Isaiah chapter 52. These last two things I mentioned, that Jesus is doing something entirely new. It's a whole new way of thinking about salvation. And that he himself is not a hero. He's not a religious teacher trying to teach people how to be more religious. No, it's something else altogether. So look at the end of chapter 52. And then the beginning of 53. We read 53, 1 to 6. But, so look at verse, we'll start in 13 of 52. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. So in that verse, Jesus does kind of look like a hero, doesn't he? I mean, he sounds kind of like a champion, a hero. He will be high and exalted. Remember what Peter said about how the prophets sought to understand the sufferings of Christ and the glory to follow. They were trying to understand. They were trying to rationalize, to understand these two different pictures of the Messiah. He's going to suffer, but he's also going to be glorified. How can those two things be reconciled? The prophets themselves didn't understand that. So here you can see why. You can see why they would write this and then wonder, what have I written? He will be exalted, but then in the very next verse, as many were astonished at you, that is the servant, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance. His appearance was beyond human recognition. I think of when he was beaten and scourged and the crown of thorns placed on his head so that he didn't even look like a man anymore. Oh my goodness. Many were astonished at you. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of man. So shall he sprinkle many nations. It is in that way, with this kind of suffering, that renders him almost monstrous. That's the way he's going to save the world. And this makes no human sense at all. This is why the scripture, Paul refers to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I know chapter 1, I've shared this with you before. I taught preaching for years and years and years. And on the first day of preaching class, I would always read from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says, we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, a stumbling block. The Greek word there is skandalon. Scandal. To the Jews, a scandal. To the Greeks, morion. To the Greeks, foolishness. We preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, a scandal. To the Greeks, foolishness. But to us who are saved, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. So Jesus does something entirely new, a whole new way of salvation that the world has never thought about before, never dreamt of. The world thinks that you're saved by leading a good life and saying your prayers and going to church or following some religious leader, some guru, or some Buddha. But no. Salvation is going to come by putting your faith and trust in the work of a righteous man, despised by the world, on the cross. So Jesus is not a hero. Go back to chapter 49. I want to share with you a fourth thing, a fourth behind-the-scenes look at Jesus. And this is to me astonishing. This is truly astonishing to me. So, chapter 49, and I'll read verse 2, and then I'll skip 3 and drop down to verse 4. He, that is God, made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. Now, look at verse 4. What does the servant, however, say about his own ministry, about his own work? What does he say? This is a behind-the-scenes look if I ever saw one, and I don't know that there's anything like this in the New Testament anywhere. What does it say? But I said, this is the servant speaking. Now, we have the privilege, because of Isaiah's prophecy, we have the privilege of getting inside the head of Jesus. If this makes any sense to you. Does that even sound possible? That you can be inside the head of Jesus? What is Jesus thinking when he's ministering, when he is healing, and he's preaching, and then ultimately, of course, he's nailed on the cross? What is he thinking? Well, Isaiah says, "But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity. He was despised and rejected of men. He had no form or comeliness that we should desire him. He was stricken, smitten of God, and we esteemed him not." We have to be very careful here. Jesus never wavered in his commitment to the will of God. Even in Gethsemane. Go to Israel, we go to Gethsemane. It's an olive grove, still there. And by the way, some of those olive trees might have been there when Jesus was there, by the way. But anyway. Anyway, Jesus prays in Gethsemane. Remember what he prays? "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." Jesus was tempted in all points just as we are. Nobody likes to suffer. Do they? Nobody likes to suffer. Jesus didn't relish suffering. He wasn't some kind of a masochist. He was a human in every way. He was the God-man, but he was the man Jesus. Tempted in all points just as we are. He felt what we feel. He felt what we feel on steroids because he was completely righteous. So Isaiah gives us a glimpse into the background. He takes us behind the scenes. He allows us inside the heart and mind of Jesus, who feels like a failure even in his absolute, unwavering obedience. You ever felt that way? You ever, I mean, goodness, I've got grown children, so that means that I was the parent of teenagers. There was a book written years ago by a Christian psychologist, "Help, I've given birth to a teenager." I won't ask for a show of hands, but, when our daughter, the first one, became a teenager, I would wake up in the morning and I would say, "Who are you and what have you done with Melody? You're not the same person that I knew yesterday." Something happened. I don't know. But at any rate, sometimes as a parent, you feel like you're just beating your head against a wall. Why do I even bother? By the way, you've heard me say this, that grandchildren are your reward for not killing your children. I see those hands. But it's not just raising kids. It's in 1,000 other. Maybe you're teaching a class, or you're whatever you're doing for the Lord. You feel like it's going nowhere. Rest easy. Jesus felt exactly the same way. He knew exactly what you're doing. Because Isaiah tells us, the servant says, "I have labored in vain." And of course, on the cross, he cries out to God, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? At the end, he felt even abandoned by God, because guess what? He was abandoned by God at that moment. God turned his eyes away from the sins of the world on his own son. Before I go to the fifth behind the scenes look at Jesus, I want to preface it with a true story. True story. You have any idea who the first American missionary was? Now, the father of missions is usually considered William Carey. He's an Englishman who went to India. But the first American missionary was a man named Adoniram Judson. And it's quite a story. It is quite a story. Judson was actually, as a college student, a rebel. He became a skeptic. I understand. I was a teenager, and I was an agnostic. I didn't know if there was a God or not as a teenager. Well, I proved that there was a God, and so forth. But anyway, so he became an agnostic, or he became a skeptic. But still went to seminary, if you can imagine, went to seminary. And while he was in seminary, came to Christ, came to faith in Christ. Felt immediately the call to the missions. And so he thought he would sail to meet Carrie in India, but he wanted to go to Burma. Meanwhile, he marries a young lady named Anne Hasseltine, whose father was a well-to-do New England merchant, but who still let his daughter marry this Christian who was going to take her off to Southeast Asia. They let her go. Anyway, so on the ship, on the way over to India, he realizes that he no longer believes in infant baptism, so he becomes a Baptist on the ship. Which means not only that he had changed denominations, but he had lost his financial support that he had back home in New England. So he had no finances now. So he winds up in India. And in India, William Carey tells him, don't go to Burma. They're all Buddhists there, and they won't listen to anything you say. But he knew that God called him there, so he goes to Burma. And I want you to hear the story. I mean, you might think I'm making this up. No, it's all true. Every bit of it's true. Read the story. He spent 19 months in prison because he was accused of being a spy when Burma went to war with England. He was accused of being a spy. He wasn't, but he was accused of being a spy. Spent 19 months in prison, a prison that was run by murderers that the government allowed to escape capital punishment in return for their overseeing the jail. Can you imagine being a prisoner in a jail run by murderers? that was Judson. He lived almost 2 years he did this. Anyway, long story short, listen, he preached the gospel, preached the gospel, preached the gospel, preached the gospel, preached the gospel. It took 6 years before he had one convert. 6 years. And then there was no flood of new converts, but gradually, little by little, a convert here, a convert there. Okay, fast forward. He died in the 1830s, so fast forward, almost 200 years, not quite, 180 years. I'm standing at a window looking out on the runways of the international airport in Rangoon, Yangon, Burma, Myanmar. I'm at the airport. I'm flying back to Singapore. Been there for a week, teaching and preaching in church in Yangon. And a man comes up beside me and invites me to come and sit down with him. Well, I didn't really want to sit down. I was actually enjoying watching the planes take off and so forth. So I didn't want to sit down, but I'm a team player, so I go sit down next to him. He's like all Burmese. He's like this tall. He's on our prayer list every single week. His name is Moon Thong. He's pastor of a church where I preached, and he's president of the seminary where I taught. And my brother Bob is taught. Why am I telling you all this? Well, here's why. Because when I sat down beside him, we started to talk a little bit. He speaks pretty good English. And here's what he says to me, verbatim. I am a trophy of Adoniram Judson. Almost 200 years. In fact, more than 200 years after Judson had gone to Burma, and it took him 6 years to make a single convert. And now, 200 years later, a pastor says to me, I am a trophy of Adoniram Judson. The Lord Jesus felt the way we often feel, like a failure. But he knew that God would vindicate him. He says that later on in chapter 49. But I want you to see something else in chapter 49. And this is the fifth behind-the-scenes look. And with this, we have to draw it to a conclusion. But I want you to look. This, for our message today, this is the theme verse. I want you to look at verse 6, Isaiah 49. Isaiah 49:6. He says, that is God says, to the servant, who is Jesus, is it too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob? In other words, is it too small a task for you to bring salvation to the Jewish people? The implied answer is, yeah, it is too small a thing, because of what he says next. And to bring back the preserved of Israel, I will make you, what does it say, church? I will make you, servant, Messiah, Jesus, I will make you what? A light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. See, that was God's plan all along for the Jewish people. He said to Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. So the Messiah is the last remaining true Israelite, and he does what God intended to do in the first place, and he does it to bring back Israel, to bring salvation to Israel, to the Jew first. But it's too light a thing to save Israel. I didn't send you just to save Israel. I sent you to bring light to the world. Oh, the wisdom of God. What a great God. What a great gospel. What a great privilege we have to be grafted into the olive stem of Israel and to take the gospel to the world. What a wonderful privilege it is. I'm going to ask you to stand, if you will, and